Let's begin with this. The State of Qatar says the 4-day truce between Israel and Hamas will be extended by 2 days.
And this is as US President Joe Biden signaled earlier that his goal is to see the truce between Hamas and Israel extended beyond today, which would mark the end of the initial 4-day pause as agreed by both sides.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has indicated that an extension would be accepted if Hamas continued to release 10 hostages per day for each additional day of pause.
This is as the United Nations Secretary General calls for the dialogue that led to this 4-day pause to continue and resulting possibly in a full humanitarian ceasefire for the benefit of the people of Gaza.
Marking the 4th day of the pause, UN Chief Antonio Guterres released a statement commending the governments of Qatar, Egypt and the United States for facilitating this arrangement that has seen guns fall silent and the release of Israeli and foreign hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails. The SG further indicated that while the pause had allowed for scaled-up humanitarian aid, that the amount still barely registered against the huge needs of about 1.7 million displaced persons in Gaza, warning that the humanitarian catastrophe in the enclave was only getting worse by the day. As diplomatic pressure now ramps up on both sides to extend the truce, including from the United States, with President Biden addressing the extension Sunday.
That's my goal. That's our goal, to keep this pause going beyond tomorrow so that we can continue to see more hostages come out and surge more humanitarian relief into those who are in need in Gaza.
Biden also spoke Sunday with the Israeli Prime Minister and, according to a White House readout, talked about the pause in fighting and the surge in much-needed humanitarian assistance into Gaza, vowing to continue working to secure the release of all hostages. But Israel was adamant that a return to military operations remained, for now, inevitable.
Here is also the framework that says it's possible to free 10 more hostages for every additional day of pause. This is welcome. In the same breath, I also said to the president that at the end of the outline, we will return with full force to achieve our goals: the elimination of Hamas, ensuring Gaza does not return to what it was, and, of course, the release of all of our hostages.
The Palestinian Authority indicating its openness to the pause being extended, with reports that negotiators were close to securing such an agreement.
Everyone is working. The Qataris, the Egyptians, the United States, the European Union, Spain, Palestine. We are all working to extend this truce by 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. We don't know. But the most important thing is to continue extending the truce, because extending the truce means stopping the killing. There is no other remedy but to end the war. There is no other option but to reach a ceasefire and work to extend it, to make it permanent. We have to end it. We must stop counting corpses.
As international consensus around the need to extend the pause only grows.
I welcome that the agreement between Hamas and Israel has led to the release of hostages and the delivery of more humanitarian aid. I call for an extension of the pause. This would allow for much needed relief to the people of Gaza and the release of more hostages. The suffering we have seen underlines the need for a lasting political solution.
This ceasefire is a good step forward, but it's not enough. I think that the large majority of the international community agreed that we need a permanent ceasefire, humanitarian ceasefire.
The UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs says that the longer the pause lasts, the more aid humanitarian agencies would be able to send in and across Gaza. Pressure is also ramping up within Israel, with families of hostages still being held in captivity, arguing for the ceasefire to be extended and for the government to do whatever was needed to see all the hostages returned home. But Israeli leaders are adamant that any extension would only be temporary and that the goal of destroying Hamas remained unchanged, despite the goodwill on display by both sides over the last 4 days. Sherwin, SABC News, New York.
Well, let's go to Sherwin, who's joining us live from the United Nations in New York. Sherwin, tonight our big story, of course, that in relation to the 51-day-old conflict, this 4-day pause has now been extended beyond today. I think there was a lot of expectation or consternation around what could happen once the 4 days was up. Just tell us a little bit more around the events surrounding this development.
Well, this just breaking the last hour, Iman, a tweet, or formerly, Twitter, the social media site now known as X. The spokesperson for the Qatari Foreign Ministry writing the following. The State of Qatar announces, as part of the ongoing mediation, an agreement has been reached to extend the humanitarian pause for an additional 2 days in the Gaza Strip, right? And so this has been the big ask from the international community, no less. Senior officials here at the United Nations. We understand that this week, U.S. Foreign Secretary, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was due to travel to Israel as part of his ongoing diplomatic efforts in the region. You heard there from President Biden speaking on Sunday in terms of his goal was to see this truce extended. We heard from the Egyptians over the weekend that a truce was likely to be extended. And so the equation really becomes important here. How many hostages does Hamas have, right, in terms of the leverage that they need in terms of these negotiations? The Israelis making it very clear that they were open to extending the pause by a day for every 10 hostages released. So by our tally, there are now 58 released, 117 Palestinian prisoners released, which means, Iman, you've got about 180 hostages still being held with Hamas. So this is very much, an equation. It's very much a system of mathematics in terms of how long Hamas can go here in terms of extending this, given the leverage they have in terms of the retention of their hostages, and how many days Israel will be able to extend this pause, given their desire to see all the hostages returned home. And we talk about this in the context of international pressure, international diplomacy. The Qataris, the Egyptians, the United States. Wang He, the foreign minister of China, will be chairing a Security Council meeting on the Middle East this week, Wednesday. But there's also been internal pressure from Israelis themselves. Israelis on the one side, Palestinians in Gaza. Let's listen to what they had to say. Watch.
We want all hostages back home now. So whatever it takes, and as long as we keep on getting them back home, I want the ceasefire to continue, and I want to do whatever is needed to have all of them back home.
I'm against all violence, and I really hope that there will be ceasefire, and I really hope that it will continue to be ceasefire, because violence is not a solution for anything. I mean, I know that those terrorists are like horrible, like they are, I can't even say they need to, of course, personally they need to be punished, but not all the other people in Gaza need to be punished.
We want to go back to our homes. We don't want war at all. We are fed up. Soon there will be rain. Where are we going to stay? Last time when it rained, we were swamped. Where shall we stay? We want a permanent truce. We don't want war. God willing, the truce will be extended.
And so the big ask from the international community, Iman, remains. How long can this pause be extended, and can it be made permanent? And as I mentioned in that earlier answer, it's a numbers game. It's dependent on how many hostages Hamas is willing to release and how long Israel is willing to extend as a result of that.
Well, based on that pretty resolute position that Benjamin Netanyahu expressed in what we've just played for our viewers as well, it makes that almost a distant wish. But these are developments that are fluid. There are negotiations, as you've just described, that are really big and intense behind the scenes. And there certainly is a lot at stake. A lot of human beings, their lives and their fortunes on both sides that are at stake. And speaking of which, the big case is being made for the extension and in humanitarian aid. This is humanitarian in nature. The Secretary General in his statement said that the aid that has now gone into Gaza barely registers against the huge needs of 1.7 million displaced people, and that the humanitarian catastrophe there is getting worse by the day. But is that message landing?
Yeah, it seems to be landing, Iman, given what the Qataris have now announced in the last hour. Clearly, the humanitarian needs on the ground have reached to high places within the US government, the Egyptian government, the European Union. We heard from the foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, earlier, lamenting the humanitarian needs on the ground. And so the international community is now increasingly speaking with one voice as it relates to the humanitarian needs on the ground. And the big takeaway from the Secretary General's comments, that statement he released earlier, is that despite the upscaling of humanitarian aid as a result of this 4-day pause, the increased quantities are still not making the dent that one would expect, that one would require, right? We talk about the numbers that are going in terms of the truckloads of aid. 170, 150, 200 trucks. One thinks in the context of this 51-day-old war that is a whole lot of aid going in, given the context of what was going in prior to that. But remember, Gaza was seeing 450 to 500 trucks of humanitarian aid going in daily before this war began on October 7th. So what has now reached places like Gaza City, northern parts of Gaza, that has been the center of this 51-day conflict, aid has only trickled into those parts. Yes, it has reached the southern parts of Gaza, but in terms of infrastructure that is damaged, the lack of fuel in Gaza, it has been difficult for those convoys to reach what essentially was a war zone for a very long time. So aid is still very much a key element to the negotiations to see this pause extended. And of course, the big ask now is for a permanent ceasefire. What do the behind-the-scenes negotiations look like in that regard? What are negotiations looking like in terms of ramping up towards talks about the two-state solution, the long view here, Iman, right? Once you have a long pause in place, what is the long-term objective here? And it is a two-state solution, two independent states living securely side by side. And that's a long ask, and it's going to take some heavy lifting from the diplomatic community moving forward.
Sherwin, we rely on you to keep your ear to the ground and to bring us the very latest on this story, which, as you've also just said, is developing almost hour to hour, day to day. That was Sherwin Bryce-Peace, our US correspondent.